want to make sure, given that we're trying to develop this collaboratively, that we make it inclusive. And I just really appreciated Christina going away and saying, rather than kind of, oh, I didn't feel, not saying anything, but actually being able to say that, and we can then use that to work forward. Okay, quite a lot to get in at the time. Okay, Nigel, thank you.
Hi. Okay. Thanks. I'm going to just talk a little bit about what I'm trying to achieve within Bath and North East Somerset. And I'm very happy to take any questions and feedback about it, because I do need to know I'm on the right track for doing some of these things, so it'll be really helpful to have that. The title of my inquiry is how can I, I've got to read it because it's so long I can't remember, how can I, as a leader within a well-performing public authority, so within Bath and North East Somerset we've just been said by Ofsted to be outstanding and excellent authority. And some of us might argue with that, and bits of it would be outstanding, but other bits perhaps not so. But that does make a difference in terms of the context, particularly around things like inclusion. How do you improve things when actually on one set of measures people are seeing it as being outstanding? So that's one context of that. So how do I improve my influence with others and contribute to the process of organisational transformation through the creation of a learning organisation? So there's several bits in that I'll come on to. Just to put it into context, my job is Head of Education Inclusion. So within that I manage the Educational Psychology Service, so I'm Principal Educational Psychologist. The Statutory Assessment Team, so the statements that get produced for youngsters, all that comes in my service. The Learning Support Service, so the youngsters go out, or a team that go out and work with people with learning difficulties. The Education Welfare Service is also part of my remit there. Education inclusion, so the strategic side of things, strategy on inclusion, strategy on attendance, strategy on special educational needs. I also commission services from elsewhere, so Traveller Education Service, Sensory Support Service, ASD Service and so on. So it's quite a wide range, mainly around the special educational needs, but not exclusively so there. Now, what I've wanted to be able to do is to say, how do I move that service forward? And we know, certainly through the work we do in inclusion, that some of our schools are not inclusive, particularly of youngsters with social problems. And the culture is, it seems to be, if we force schools to take some of these youngsters, then examination results may go down and we may no longer be an outstanding authority. So you get a real tension about how can you improve inclusion when actually everybody thinks, a lot of people think it's okay at the moment. So we've got pressure on our special schools to take more youngsters, so they're beginning to overflow. Pressures on the budgets because of that. So there's lots and lots of pressures happening. So it's within that sort of context that I wanted to look at my practice. Now I could have said to my team, and there are about 50, 60 people there, okay, we'll go through a management program, I'm going to put people through a diploma in management and so on. I really didn't think that was going to be the way forward for people. I've done those sort of things, and it really, whilst there's some learning on the way to those things, it wasn't gaining the qualification that really gave me that. It's the own reflection on parts of the journey through those bits as well. I did a master's which finished in around 2005, and looking at leadership and management, and part of that was around learning organisation, developing learning organisations. So I was really interested in that sort of aspect of it, but didn't really know how to use that when I came into the local authority. One of the things was setting up a cafe, what we call a conversation cafe. So every week we meet, we've been doing this now for about 5, getting on 6 years I think. We meet, Jack joined us very early on, and we sit and we talk about some of the buzzes we've had, some of the reflections we've had, bring some of the writings that we've done to that, as a reflective group, and that's been very helpful. So that was one aspect of it. The other bit is about how I behave with other people and how I can influence things. And again, when I spoke to Joan last year, basically, before last, I'm now about 5 times removed from children in terms of direct influence. So how do I have an influence on outcomes for children? Because that's what I'm in it for. You know, I am in a position there where I don't want promotion. I'm happy with my lot. So it's not about, pushing myself up the greasy pole for things. I want to make a difference for youngsters. And how do I do that when I very rarely meet a child now? I have to do that through my managers and through their teams. So it's looking at that process as how I can actually influence the organisation for the bottom line, which is about improving a lot of children and young people. And generally, the world which we live in is the vulnerable children and young people, although I'm interested in improving a lot for everybody if I possibly can, but some of those youngsters get disadvantaged by being in the system. So my influence then is really about the relationships that I have with people like Chris, Marie and other managers. So what I've tried to do, and in terms of the way I work with people, is to look at my practice and how I work, using Chris as an example. Chris, when I first started in the local authority, Chris had responsibility for monitoring the inclusion strategy, which I inherited. One of the problems is that we didn't know what we were doing in terms of inclusion. One of the lines in there was around promote a kite mark for inclusion. Well, when I spoke to Chris, we were both thinking, well, what's this about? Do we invent one ourselves? No. So we worked together to look at what was already available, and then, for me supporting Chris to go out and find what was right, answering those awkward questions. Like, a really awkward question we had was, what if we say a school is inclusive, and Ofsted come along and say, no, it's not? That will totally undermine what we've done, lose our credibility. So we really had to look carefully about how we can do that, and make sure it happened. It's been very successful. The clip, if you came to Jack's talk, I was talking up there with not much energy, but I was talking. But that was a celebration of the inclusion quality. The schools were there, about 300 people with children. Children come out and performing on the stage about what they thought about inclusion and so on. The feedback is, and is part of the claim I'm making, is that has actually had an effect on the way in which schools think about children and young people. And there is evidence there which I need to gather, but we are having that effect on institutions and the way in which teachers are thinking about inclusion. I'm also working with the head of the Learning Support Service, and trying to, through the way at which I try to work, and it is evolving because obviously I'm researching into my practice and how I do things, but it's almost, and I described it, whether it's what we'll end up with, but almost in a bubble with somebody, and within that bubble I'm trying to build the confidence. I'm trying to get them to look at their practice, for them to feel confident about what they're doing, and then I step out of that and monitor what they're doing, stepping in and out as I need to, be able to hold people as they go through and develop what they need to do. So it's, sort of things like it's the no blame, we're in it together, terrible phrase these days, but we are, and that's the sort of culture that I'm trying to create. That has helped because that manager now is going back to her team and has developed a reflective practice within that team where teachers will sit down and talk about their work in terms of things like their report writing. What difference is it making to the young person? And they're changing their behaviour and changing their report writing, etc., so that it does make more of a difference. So again, I'm thinking that we're beginning to have influence, and hopefully that will impact on the children, young people, the teachers in the schools and so on. So that sort of evidence is beginning to come out now. But there are so many pressures on as well. Since I started this, we obviously knew we had budget problems, and almost when I started we had budget problems, but we now have a change of government in May, as everybody knows. The Conservative manifesto was around saying things like, reversing the bias towards inclusion, and that's a really nasty phrase that keeps going. So what's the point? Why are we doing this? Nobody's going to value inclusion anymore, and so on. And we were talking earlier about, well, I don't care what the government called it. you know, our values are around inclusion, we will be inclusive. And if we have to call it something different to please the government, then we will. But our values are still there to be able to continue to do that work, because that's the moral purpose of what we're trying to achieve. So those things are there. And a big one for us is academies. The academies are taking money out of the education system. That's reducing the capacity I've got to work with people. They're going to be driving the agenda an awful lot. And is that going to be in the interest of children and young people, particularly those who are disadvantaged and socially vulnerable, if you like? I just had an email today where the Director of Children's Services for the authority has agreed with a group of schools in the Norton Radstock area that they will, and he put, take over, stroke, absorb some of the local authority services. Now that's going to be a real challenge for me to manage my teams through that in a living theory way, in the sense that we can resist some of these things, but in the end we've got to go with some of these things. There's lots of things we can't do, and we need to learn as we go through, so that our practice is, and people feel confident about changing their practice. This is really transforming these days. Not necessarily, you know, I'm pushing for that, although I would like to transform the culture, but it's going to be transformed for us. You know, it's whether that transformation is going to be something we like at the end of it or not. My view is that we've got to work with it to try and get it close to what we want it to be in a few years' time. So those things are really happening. So yeah, again, it's actually working with staff and trying to keep that that moral purpose, that bit about we are a learning organisation, we will say things, we will not be embarrassed about saying them, and we will work together on trying to solve some of these problems. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Okay. Yeah, that's great, absolutely great. Any questions anybody wants to ask?